I knew the tone was off the moment Ethan said, "I don't think she needs to be in this meeting." He didn't even look at me, just tapped his tablet and added, "This is a strategy session, not a legacy debrief." That was the moment, not the cruelest thing he'd said, but the one that told me I was being erased like a sticky note after a quarterly close. My husband, Daniel, who once introduced me at conferences as the backbone of Parker Logistics, pretended not to hear, adjusted his glasses, nodded, and kept flipping through his notes. I clicked my pen closed, set it on my legal pad full of vendor risk notes, and walked out of the glass-walled boardroom without a word. The sound of my heels on carpet was soft, final. People expect shouting, slammed doors, some viral scene they can gossip about at lunch. Silence lingers longer. We'd built Parker Logistics from a one-car garage behind our house in Denver. I managed vendor contracts, wrote the first invoices, filed our early taxes with a $3 calculator. Daniel was the face, I was the infrastructure. It worked, until the face decided the infrastructure didn't photograph well. When Ethan came back from an MBA program on the East Coast, some overpriced institute with a motto in Latin, he arrived with a deck full of buzzwords: disruption, lean transformation, vertical integration. He used verticalize like it was a real verb. Within a week, my title changed from executive financial coordinator to advisor to the CEO. Then just advisor. Then it vanished altogether. Daniel told me, "Let him try, Ava. He's young, eager like a crow picking at bones." The next thing Ethan did was lock me out of the budget reviews. "Finance is moving to a real-time dashboard," he said with a grin, not spreadsheets and Post-its. The irony was that dashboard still pulled data from the system I built. The Post-its were field expense notes from the cruise I'd visited: hard hat, steel-toe boots, the works. Vendors still called me when payments lagged. One even drove up from Pueblo to hand me an invoice, muttering, "No offense, ma'am, but I don't trust that kid with a roll of quarters." Every quarter, I'd meet our lending officer, Martin Gray, for lunch at a small courtyard cafe. He always ordered the Cobb salad and asked, "How's the engine running?" Never the balance sheet, always the engine. He liked my straight answers. The last lunch we had, he leaned in and asked, "You're still listed as guarantor on the security covenant, right?" I nodded. He exhaled like that mattered. Ethan never once asked why we had such favorable loan terms. He assumed it was Daniel's reputation. Not my 20-year credit record. Not the relationships I'd maintained. Not my name on the covenant that secured the last $3.2 million line. Soon, Ethan was talking about IPOs, valuations, exit multiples. Daniel drifted, showed up twice a week, mostly for golf or to forward Forbes articles titled "Future of AI Logistics." I became a ghost, smiled at politely, dropped from group lunches. When the office manager reassigned my parking spot to Ethan's dog walker, I didn't argue. I just kept the books clean and the bills paid. Until that meeting. "The most valuable contribution you can make," Ethan said, "is to walk through that door." Daniel looked down, silent. So I did, but I didn't go home. Back in my office, still with my name on the door, I opened the fireproof cabinet and pulled our original loan folder. Clause 14B. I'd underlined it years ago. In the event of removal, resignation, or termination of the named corporate guarantor, the lender reserves the right to initiate full call or reassignment of debt within 72 hours. I read it twice. Once as Ava Parker, wife. Once as Ava Parker, guarantor. Then I locked the cabinet and exhaled. They thought I'd left. I hadn't even started. The next strategy meeting wasn't scheduled so much as declared. Ethan sent out a calendar invite titled Q4 Vision Alignment and Growth Strategy. No agenda, just that smug confidence that everyone would show up grateful to orbit his brilliance. I arrived early, an old habit from when I used to fix projectors and rewire network cables before client calls. Ethan walked in 20 minutes late, smelling like expensive espresso and entitlement, trailed by two consultants. Identical haircuts, identical MacBooks, identical lack of soul. Daniel followed, looking like he'd slept in his shirt. He gave me a weak smile, the kind you give someone who used to matter. Ethan clicked the remote. The screen filled with buzzwords: agility, disruption, scalable mindset. One slide read, legacy loyalty. He started preaching like a startup founder trying to impress investors. And while we honor the contributions of our foundational team, he said, eyes flicking toward me, we must recognize when systems and personnel no longer align with scalable growth. The consultants nodded like bobbleheads. I stared at the blank page in front of me. No spreadsheets, no numbers, just space. I wasn't there to contribute. I was there to be erased politely. It's time, Ethan said. We need to redefine roles built for a different era. Emotional capital isn't operational relevance. My pulse slowed, not quickened. The body knows when the blade's already fallen. He turned to me, rehearsed tone dripping false empathy. Ava, the most valuable contribution you can make now is to walk through that door and let us build forward. Daniel didn't blink. He didn't speak. The man who once called me the engine of the company stared at the table as if it held a trap door. I smoothed my blouse, pushed back my chair, and stood. No theatrics, just motion. The silence that followed felt heavier than sound. I walked out, but not out of the building. I went straight to my office, locked the door, and pulled open the bottom drawer of my old steel cabinet. The thing was ugly, gray, dented, humming faintly from a warped fan nearby. But it held every loan document that mattered. I found the 2017 file, opened it, and ran my finger down the page until it stopped at Clause 14B. I'd signed it personally. Martin had insisted. The bank likes Daniel, he'd said, but it trusts you. My pen marks were still there, faint but red. Lender reserves the right to initiate full call or reassignment of debt within 72 hours. 72 hours. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the muffled laughter from the boardroom across the hall. They were celebrating their first strategic realignment. They thought they'd fired a relic. They'd actually terminated their guarantor. The next morning, I called the bank. Martin had retired. Florida, painting seascapes, living the quiet life. So I got his replacement, a young woman named Alexis Reed. Corporate lending, this is Lexi, she said, voice calm and practiced. Hi, this is Ava Parker, I replied. I'm calling to confirm a change in my status as named guarantor on our 2017 covenant, account ending in 5401. I was terminated yesterday. Silence, then a click of keyboard keys. One moment, she said. Yes, I do see your name listed as guarantor. You're saying your employment status has changed? Correct. I'm no longer with the company. Longer pause this time, brittle around the edges. I see. Thank you for notifying us. I'll flag this for compliance review. Could I have a contact number in case we need further documentation? I gave her my cell. She read it back carefully, twice. Anything else I can assist with, Mrs. Parker? No, I said. That'll do. She hung up like someone sealing a box marked fragile. No alarms, no immediate fallout, just corporate quiet, the kind that builds pressure. Banks hate uncertainty. They prefer signatures and guarantees. And now, the name guaranteeing $3.2 million in outstanding loans no longer existed inside Parker Logistics. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't text Ethan. I put on a coat, poured coffee into a travel mug, and walked 2 laps around the industrial park until my head cleared. They thought I'd left empty-handed, but what I'd taken with me wasn't paper or data. It was leverage, legal, signed, and time-stamped leverage. By the time I got back home, The company's LinkedIn page had already transformed into a shrine for Ethan's ego. Parker Logistics enters its next era, the headline read, with a photo of him standing in front of our Denver headquarters, arms crossed like a catalog model for arrogance. The caption, "Proud to lead this incredible team into the next chapter. Change is never easy, but true leadership embraces transformation." The comments rolled in. So well deserved. Finally, a modern vision, exciting times ahead, each one like a paper cut dipped in salt. None of them knew that Ethan once asked me how to reissue a check, or that he'd locked himself out of the payroll system for 2 weeks and blamed HR. None of them knew he couldn't explain what Net 30 meant if you gave him a flowchart and a puppet show. Daniel, for his part, reposted the announcement with 3 clapping hand emojis. I stared at the screen, numb, then closed my laptop. I could have screamed. I could have broken something. Instead, I made soup, lentils, carrots, onions, the kind that takes all day and tastes like control. When I sat down, the smell filled the kitchen, and for the first time in months, I felt steady. Not reactive, strategic. There's a difference. I opened my legal pad and began to write. Action items. 1. Confirm status with Lexi Reed. 2. Review covenant language. 3. Obtain HR removal documentation. Pending. 4. Contact potential acquisition leads. Pending. That 4th line made me pause. I'd met someone 2 weeks earlier at a Chamber of Commerce mixer, a corporate strategist named Ben Moreland. His firm specialized in acquisitions of underperforming mid-sized logistics assets. At the time, I'd brushed him off. But now, the phrase asset assumption replayed in my head like a drumbeat. I spent the next few hours combing through documents, loan schedules, vendor contracts, compliance records. My signature was everywhere. The guarantor clause tied directly to operating debt, meaning without me, the bank had full authority to demand repayment or reassign the loan entirely. All I had to do was make sure the right people saw it. At 6:47 p.m., another post from Ethan appeared on my feed. Leadership isn't about titles. It began. It's about choices. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the most necessary. Below was another photo. Ethan standing at the podium in our atrium, basking in fluorescent light, eyes full of hubris. He thought this was the hard part. He hadn't even imagined what was coming. Revenge doesn't need fireworks. Sometimes it just needs silence and a well-timed clause. The next morning, I called Martin. He picked up on the second ring, his voice still that low Midwestern rumble. Ava Parker. "Haven't heard that name in months," he said. "I was hoping you were calling for a fishing recommendation." "Not quite," I replied. "I need your eyes on something." I met him later that afternoon at a diner off Highway 36, the kind of place where the coffee is burnt, but they refill it before you can complain. He was already there when I arrived, tie slightly askew, glasses smudged, still carrying that calm authority that only comes from 40 years of watching balance sheets rise and fall. "You look like you've been thinking 3 steps ahead," he said, sliding me a mug. "Always," I replied, setting a folder on the table. When he opened it, his eyebrows rose. Clause 14 to B stared back at him in red ink. He read it twice, lips moving silently. "You're telling me this clause was triggered?" he asked. "Yesterday morning," I said. Ethan thought firing me would make him look decisive. Martin exhaled slowly. "Good Lord. You always were the reason we extended that credit. Daniel's a talker. But you were the one who made this place credible." "I still am," I said, meeting his eyes. "At least to the bank." He leaned back, booth creaking under his weight. "You're not here to burn it down, are you?" "Not unless they make me," I said, smiling faintly. "Right now, I'm just exploring options." He nodded. "Fair enough. You've got 72 hours before the compliance team acts. That's a small window, but a powerful one. Long enough, I said, and for the first time, I saw it. Quiet, measured, inevitable. The path unfolding exactly as they'd built it. They thought they'd erased me, but they'd only signed the fuse. 2 days later, Parker Logistics hosted a full-blown press conference inside the atrium I'd helped design when the company still had 6 employees and a prayer. Now it looked like a stage set. Banners, interns in color-matched polos, rental spotlights. Ethan stood behind the podium like a boy playing CEO, flanked by 2 consultants who looked Xeroxed from the same brochure. "We are entering a bold, data-driven era," he announced. "While we appreciate those who built our foundation, we can't be shackled by legacy systems or legacy mindsets." The audience chuckled politely. My phone buzzed on the counter at home. A text from one of my old team leads. "Did he just call your entire department legacy baggage?" I typed back, "Yes, bless his heart." The irony was that his shiny new automation portal, the one he was bragging about on stage, was the same third-party system we'd pilot tested 2 years earlier and dropped after it failed every compliance audit. He'd just renamed it Vision, and nobody in that room realized HR had misfiled my exit paperwork. The notice marked me as involuntary termination, not voluntary resignation. It was the difference between leaving quietly and being legally fired. That one checked box meant the covenant clause wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was live. I'd gotten a copy of the form from an old friend in operations. She slipped it to me after hours, whispering, "You didn't hear this from me." I thanked her, bought her coffee, and went home to work. 2 folders sat on my desk. The first was for the bank: covenant clause, termination record, my notarized guarantor signature, loan schedules, everything Union Capital would need to confirm breach. The second was my contingency: a clean acquisition proposal for Moreland & Company, the same private group I'd met at the mixer. It offered a full assumption of Parker's debt in exchange for its assets, contracts, and goodwill. No layoffs, no litigation, just transfer of ownership. That night, while Ethan's Instagram post showed him shaking hands with a software partner, captioned, "Exciting collab incoming," I was on a Zoom call with Ben Moreland himself. He looked up from his mug stamped Go Blue and said, "You're certain the bank will act?" "They don't have to act," I replied. "They just have to read the clause." He smiled. "All right, send me the final documents when you're ready." After we hung up, I stared at the acquisition draft one last time, double-checked every date, saved it to a private drive, and shut the laptop. The countdown was already ticking. The call came at 7:42 a.m. the next morning, right as Ethan was finishing his iced coffee and listening to a podcast called Leaders Who Disrupt. The receptionist buzzed him twice. "Ethan, Union Capital is requesting an emergency in-person meeting this morning." He rolled his eyes. "Tell them to email if it's important. They said it involves a breach of covenant." That made him pause, but only for a heartbeat. "It's compliance noise," he said, waving her off. 10 minutes later, the main phone in Daniel's office rang. He answered groggily, voice thick from another late dinner and 2 bourbons. "This is Daniel Parker." "Mr. Parker, this is Peter Shelton from Union Capital's Security Compliance Division. We need to discuss a possible material disclosure failure related to your operating agreement. We'll arrive at 10:30. Daniel sat up straight. "Material failure?" "Yes, sir. Potential breach under Clause 14B. He didn't ask which clause. He just muttered, "We'll be ready," and hung up like someone who'd just seen a ghost. Then he called Ethan. "They said what?" Ethan laughed between bites of a protein bar. "Dad, relax. It's procedural. We'll smile, nod, say everything's fine." He had no idea that the ground under his sneakers was already gone. By 10:15, the boardroom buzzed with nervous chatter. Legal counsel, CFO, HR rep, clutching a folder she hadn't read. At 10:32, the doors opened. 3 people from Union Capital walked in: Shelton, a compliance lawyer, and a young analyst. They didn't sit. They placed a single thick folder on the table. Ethan started his greeting. "Gentlemen, thanks for coming." "Where is Ava Parker?" Shelton asked. "She's no longer with the company," Ethan said quickly. "She, stepped down last week." Shelton tilted his head. "Stepped down?" "Yes, voluntarily." The lawyer opened the folder, revealing the stamped HR form with that fatal black check mark: involuntary termination. Daniel's face drained of color. "This," the lawyer said evenly, "qualifies as executive-level involuntary termination. Would you agree?" Ethan stammered. "It wasn't meant that way. It was symbolic." "Symbolic?" Shelton's voice cut through the room. "You terminated your named corporate guarantor. Clause 14B grants us authority to initiate a full call or reassignment of debt within 72 hours. No one breathed. The HR rep looked ready to faint, and that was my cue. The door at the end of the boardroom opened quietly, and I stepped inside before anyone could recover from the shock. I'd used my old access code. Apparently, no one had thought to deactivate it yet. The bank's compliance team turned as I entered, and Peter Shelton's expression softened into recognition. "Mrs. Parker," he said, "thank you for coming. The documents you sent were illuminating." Ethan looked like he'd seen a ghost. Daniel just whispered my name like it hurt to say it. I took a seat at the far end of the table, where the light from the glass wall caught every uneasy face in full clarity. Shelton didn't waste time. He opened his binder and began reading, calm as a surgeon. "According to your lending agreement with Union Capital, dated June 14th, 2017, Clause 14, subsection B states, in the event of removal, resignation, or termination of the named corporate guarantor, the lender reserves the right to initiate full call or reassignment of debt within 72 hours. He paused, scanning the table. The CFO's hands trembled. The HR rep's eyes darted toward the exit. Ethan tried to smirk, but it came out more like a grimace. "Look," he said, "this is just a paperwork issue. We didn't mean to terminate her. It was symbolic, just a—" Shelton's lawyer cut him off. "Intent is irrelevant. Documentation is what governs lending compliance, and your documentation clearly shows a formal, involuntary termination of your guarantor." Daniel's mouth opened, but no words came out. The CFO finally whispered, "Oh, God." Shelton continued, flipping another page. Effective 9:38 a.m. Tuesday, Mrs. Parker was no longer legally affiliated with this entity. Therefore, Union Capital must suspend all active credit privileges pending review. Unless an alternate guarantor is approved and the covenant renegotiated within 48 hours, the full loan balance will be due immediately. The silence in the room was thick, metallic. Ethan shot up from his chair, voice cracking. "This is insane! We're in the middle of a restructure. You can't just pull the rug out because of one misfiled form." "You can call it a misfiled form," Shelton replied. Still even, "We call it a breach of covenant." He closed the folder with a deliberate snap. "Our compliance division will begin reassessment at noon." I let them all sit in it for a few seconds, panic seeping into the air like ink in water, before I spoke. "You fired your guarantor," I said softly. "You didn't just erase a title. You erased the signature keeping your roof intact." Daniel turned toward me, his voice small. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I did," I said. "Back when we signed that agreement, you just weren't listening." Shelton looked between us, then back at Ethan. "Gentlemen, we'll await a formal response. If there's no solution by the deadline, Union Capital will proceed with collateral evaluation." He gathered his papers, and that's when I opened my own folder. One smooth motion, no drama, no gloating. "There is a solution," I said. Every head turned. I slid a neatly tabbed document toward him. This is an asset assumption proposal from a third-party entity, AP Holdings. They've agreed to assume all outstanding debt obligations, effective immediately upon approval. The CFO blinked. Wait, you brought a buyer? I smiled faintly. No, I am the buyer. Ethan scoffed, trying to muster defiance. You're bluffing. You don't even work here. I don't need to, I said. I'm the named acquirer. The proposal is pre-approved by the bank, pending covenant confirmation. I'm offering full repayment continuity and preservation of all active contracts. No defaults, no layoffs. Shelton skimmed the top page and gave a single nod. Clean, well-structured. The lawyer added, It's legally viable. The board murmured, some leaning closer, others staring down at their hands like the table might swallow them. Ethan's face flushed deep red. This is theft. You're hijacking us. No, I corrected, calm as ice. You hijacked stability. I'm offering rescue. Daniel looked shattered. Ava, this isn't you? You're right, I said. This is the version you stopped listening to. Shelton straightened his jacket. We'll review Mrs. Parker's offer immediately. If Union Capital approves, the debt will transfer to AP Holdings at noon tomorrow. And just like that, control shifted. The company Ethan thought he'd modernized now hung by the signature he'd erased, and the woman who still owned it on paper. The air in the boardroom felt different now, thick, heavy, like static before a storm. No one spoke for several seconds. Ethan stood there, jaw tight, eyes darting from the banker to me to the packet of papers that might as well have been a detonator. The CFO finally broke the silence, voice trembling. If we accept her proposal, what happens to our equity positions? Shelton's lawyer answered before I could. They're dissolved in the transfer. Debt obligations move under the new entity's jurisdiction. Any remaining value depends on the buyer's discretion. That made a few board members sit straighter. Others looked like they'd been punched. Ethan slammed his palm on the table. This is ridiculous. You can't just stroll in here and take everything. I met his glare evenly. I didn't stroll in. I built this room. I wired the contracts, balanced the books, and guaranteed the loans you didn't bother to read. I'm not taking anything. I'm keeping it from collapsing. The lawyer gave a dry, professional cough. Legally speaking, she's correct. Ethan turned to Daniel, desperate. Dad, say something. This is our company. Daniel looked older than I'd ever seen him. Eyes sunken, hands trembling as he rubbed his temples. No, son, he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. It was our company. Now it's her leverage. He wasn't wrong. The CFO whispered to Shelton, If we reject this, what are our options? Asset seizure, Shelton replied. Union Capital would begin liquidating within 72 hours. Equipment, vehicles, IP, vendor contracts, everything pledged as collateral. You could almost hear the blood drain from Ethan's face. His voice cracked. You can't be serious. I am, Shelton said, packing up his folder. But Mrs. Parker is offering you a path out. I'd suggest you take it. The lawyer gathered his papers, nodded once at me, and the three of them, bank, counsel, analyst, walked out, leaving the door swinging quietly behind them. Ethan collapsed back into his chair. You planned this. I closed my folder, slid it neatly into my briefcase. No, Ethan, I prepared for this. There's a difference. Daniel's gaze lifted to meet mine, watery and lost. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked around the boardroom, the polished table, the stale coffee, the fake optimism posters Ethan had hung about innovation and team synergy. The company that had once been built on trust now felt like a hollow showroom. Because, I said finally, every time I warned you, you called it overthinking. Every time I showed you risk, you called it pessimism. So I stopped warning. I started planning. Ethan pushed himself up from the chair, hands shaking. You're ending everything. You're destroying Dad's legacy. I picked up my coat. I'm ending your version of it, the one that erased the people who built it. The board members exchanged wary glances. One of them, a quiet man named Randall who'd been there since our early trucking contracts, cleared his throat. We should call a vote. Ethan spun toward him. A vote? You can't seriously... But no one was listening anymore. The CFO was already dialing his attorney. Another director was flipping through my proposal. The room's energy had shifted completely, away from Ethan's bluster and toward inevitability. I walked toward the glass doors. You saw me as the soft one, I said over my shoulder. The one who smiled, stayed late, and kept the wheels turning. But I was also the signature at the bottom of every page, and that signature always came with terms. The words hung there, still and final. I opened the door and stepped into the corridor. Behind me, Ethan shouted something. I couldn't make it out, but the sound faded under the hum of the building's HVAC. The same system he'd refused to replace because it wasn't a revenue driver. Outside, the sky had that washed-out autumn light, pale and sharp. I crossed the parking lot slowly, folder pressed against my chest like something sacred. By the time I reached my car, my phone buzzed. A single email notification from Union Capital. Acknowledgement of transfer proposal. Under executive review. I didn't smile. I didn't even breathe for a moment. Just leaned against the car and let the November air sting my face. Inside that boardroom, they were probably scrambling, calling lawyers, drafting statements, arguing over who was to blame, but none of it mattered now. The mechanism had already turned. The clause was live, the offer was real, and by morning, ownership would change hands. For the first time in years, I felt no anger, only quiet, deliberate peace. When I arrived at the building the next morning, the glass facade reflected a sky so clear it almost looked staged. Across the street, a new brass plaque had just been mounted on a set of freshly cleaned windows. AP Holdings. The letters gleamed under the sunlight like they'd been waiting for this exact moment. Inside, Union Capital's black sedan was already parked out front. I walked past it, calm, steady, briefcase in hand. In the lobby, a nervous receptionist looked up. Mrs. Parker, they're in the boardroom. I know, I said. When I stepped inside, the room was nearly identical to the day before. But now, the air was heavier, resigned. Ethan looked wrecked, pale under the fluorescent lights, his tie crooked, his confidence gone. Daniel sat beside him, hollow-eyed, gripping a cup of cold coffee he hadn't touched. The CFO looked 10 years older. Peter Shelton from Union Capital stood near the head of the table, a manila envelope in hand. He turned as I entered. Mrs. Parker, he said evenly, your offer has been reviewed and approved. Transition will begin at 10 a.m. today. He extended his hand. Union Capital appreciates your clarity. I shook his hand. Thank you, Mr. Shelton. The sound of the handshake might as well have been a gavel. Ethan sprang up, red-faced. This isn't fair! You didn't even warn us! You blindsided your own family! I looked at him. This boy who had turned arrogance into a career, who had mistaken volume for vision, and felt no hate, just exhaustion. Ethan, I said quietly, you warned yourselves every time you ignored me. He looked at his father for support, but Daniel didn't move. His voice was barely a whisper. Why didn't you tell me, Ava? I did, I replied. You just weren't listening. Shelton gathered the documents and slid them across the table. As of this morning, he said, Union Capital's obligations to Parker Logistics are concluded. The debt has been assumed in full by AP Holdings. The transition of assets and operations will proceed under their authority. One of the board members, Randall, nodded slowly. So, it's done. It's done, Shelton confirmed. Ethan sank into his chair, the sound of defeat sharp in the quiet. You destroyed us. No, I said. You destroyed what you didn't understand. I just stopped holding it together. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the lawyer from Union Capital closed his case, nodded to Shelton, and the two men left, leaving a silence that was cleaner than any apology could have been. I collected my folder, lighter now, and walked to the door. I paused just long enough to look back. Daniel's eyes met mine, full of something that used to be love, now buried under layers of regret. I held his gaze and said, the most valuable contribution I ever made wasn't what I built here. It was knowing when to walk out. And then I left. Outside, the crisp November wind cut across the parking lot. I stood for a moment at the curb, watching as the sunlight caught the new lettering across the street. AP Holdings, mine, clean, simple. Not revenge, just reclamation. A technician was peeling the last strip of plastic film from the sign. It fluttered in the breeze for a heartbeat, then drifted to the pavement like a shed skin. I didn't smile. I didn't need to, because silence had done what noise never could. Inside that boardroom, they would argue for weeks, blaming forms, audits, anyone but themselves. Ethan would talk about restructuring. Daniel would talk about legacy. The board would talk about lessons learned. And through it all, the one constant truth would remain. I had been the guarantor, the name under the covenant, the woman whose quiet diligence held their empire together. And when they erased me, they erased their foundation. I walked toward my new office. The keys felt cool in my hand, the building still smelling faintly of fresh paint and new beginnings. As I reached the door, I glanced at the clock. 9:59 a.m., 1 minute before transfer. The hum of the city outside sounded almost like applause. I stepped inside, placed my folder on the desk, and whispered to no one in particular. The most valuable contribution I made wasn't staying. It was knowing exactly when to leave. Then I sat down, opened my laptop, and began again.